Once upon a time, I made a video about why 18th century grenadiers, for the most part, didn't actually use grenades. This was owing to a wide variety of reasons, but most of them boiled down to just how impractical of a tool early hand grenades were in open linear combat. They were heavy and clumsy to throw, they were notoriously unreliable, and of course only usable at very close range. They were good weapons in a siege environment, but outside of that, grenadiers would more typically act as any other unit of heavy infantry, and over time, as grenades were used less and less, being a grenadier became more of an honorific, more of a status symbol than anything else. But one question that I've seen since then is, why not put the grenadiers on horseback then? That way they could ride up, throw the grenades, and ride away, thus surely solving many of those issues of range and whatnot that I outlined in the video, correct? Well, not quite, because in fact horse grenadiers did actually exist, and for a time they were quite popular across many European armies, although they didn't quite operate in the way that you might be hoping that they would, nor were they particularly effective in their unique role, and ultimately, much like their counterparts in the infantry, by the end of the early modern era, the horse grenadiers would have very little to distinguish them from their fellow cavalrymen. So in this video, who were the Horse Grenadiers? What was the intention behind them, and how were they actually used? We'll answer all of those questions and more in this video brought to you by the Native Oak and our mission to create accessible, educational content that promotes the love of history and even supports charitable causes, which you can learn all about by visiting us at nativeoak.org. This video is also sponsored by Aura, so let's have a brief word on their behalf, and then we shall begin.
Looks like they're coming on again. Sergeant, have the men fix bayonets. I don't think that's a good idea, sir. Look! Ho 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 ho! The English big dogs, they never expect us to steal their data. We shall steal their identities and have their navy escort us themselves into London. They shall never suspect it. Ho 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 ho! My God! Our information is open for the world to see. Curse those data brokers for publishing it on their countless websites and selling it all to the highest bidder. We're defenseless. Not quite, sir. Remember, we have Aura. They keep our personal data safe with their data broker monitoring service, taking our information down from those sites automatically. Of course. And with their identity theft protections and alerts, they'll let us know right away if any dastardly hackers get through. We can lock or freeze our credit right away and ensure that our social security numbers, because of course we as British Napoleonic soldiers totally have those, make sure they're safe. And even if the worst does occur, sir, Aura offers us identity theft insurance up to $5 million. Very good, Sergeant. Now if you would, deploy the Aura VPN. I should like us to become totally invisible to the foe. Have us appear as if we are in, well, any one of the other 100+ virtual locations on offer. Would you? Yes, sir. Company, fix your Aura VPNs. Oh no, the roast beef all have Aura. We'll never get their data now. I've completely lost the accent. The Emperor shall be most displeased with us. Oh, yes, indeed, he shall be. Thank you to Aura for sponsoring this video. Visit aura.com/brandsnf or click on the link in the description down below to get your first 14 days totally for free. So, oui, baguette, let's return to those mounted grenadiers.
As with so much of early modern military history, the concept of horse grenadiers got their start in France with their grenadiers à cheval. After their initial establishment in 1676 for service in Louis XIV's myriad wars, the trend spread like wildfire across Europe, with everyone from the Spanish to the Scottish to the Russians adopting units of their own. In England, these came in the form of the Horse Grenadier Guards, initially as only a troop of the Life Guards, and then later detached into their own regiment when the Scottish and English armies then combined, resulting from the First Acts of Union in 1707. Both countries' regiments of Horse Guards were amalgamated, with the Scottish unit becoming the second troop, Horse Grenadier Guards. Now, unlike the Life Guards, who consisted primarily of gentlemen, the Horse Grenadier Guards pulled from the normal line cavalry for much of their membership. That's an important detail, which would lead to some tensions within the cavalry, as we'll discuss a little bit later on. Now, as you might expect, this unit in particular is going to be the chief focus of this video, but really most of what I say here will be broadly applicable to most of these units wherever they happen to be based. So whatever the precise details of how they were formed, how they were equipped, and all the rest, typically speaking, across Europe, these units would be heralded as being elite, heavy troops, much like their infantry counterparts. In fact, in the 1786 book Military Antiquities, respecting a history of the English army, it describes that these units were a direct imitation of the infantry grenadiers. And looking at their uniforms and whatnot, you can see how they are very much a one-to-one sans the horse. They just happen to be on horseback. So what did that look like in the actual field? How were these men expected to fight? And more importantly, of course, how effective were they at it? Most of these units, including the Horse Grenadier Guards, were expected to perform in much the same way, as was defined, among many other examples, in the Military Dictionary of 1778. Horse Grenadiers, called by the French grenadiers volants, or flying grenadiers, are such as are mounted on horseback and fight on foot. Their exercise is the same with other grenadiers. That's right, I hate to disappoint, but these units were actually intended to fight dismounted, not to be hurling grenades from horseback. And as less exciting as that is, it makes sense. Like I said before, grenades were heavy and clumsy, and trying to throw them while on a horseback would be immensely difficult, let alone trying to do so accurately. Really, trying to throw a grenade while on horseback would probably have all the same problems, and far more of them even, than trying to use them on foot. And besides, if a unit of cavalry were actually going to charge in to be within the range of throwing those grenades, and if they survived all the musketry fire up to that point, well, they'll probably be better off just charging in with their swords than anything else. And in fact, that is typically what they did. Much like how the foot grenadiers would very rarely, if ever, be using grenades outside of a siege environment, the horse grenadiers also wouldn't find much use for them in open field, and more often than not, they really were just behaving as another unit of heavy cavalry. So what about during those sieges, and those other rare moments where grenades actually could be effectively used? Well, in which more limited case, yes, they could fight in their expected role as mounted grenadiers. As I understand it, although my research into this is a lot more limited, so don't quote me as gospel here, as I understand it, the French units did so on occasion, and they did so to pretty decent effect. But more broadly speaking, and especially again in the case of the British units, the important thing is that those opportunities to actually fight as grenadiers were highly limited. You can imagine how, in a siege, the actual advantage of having your grenadiers be mounted would be fairly limited. You know, whether they're within the defenses throwing the grenades out, or if they are storming the works, either way, the need for that added mobility, like on an open field and whatnot, the need for speed wouldn't be, horrible movie, wouldn't necessarily be anywhere near so strong as it would on open field. So the explicit need for having the grenadiers be mounted was often even less apparent than having a need for grenadiers throwing grenades at all. It's already a fairly limited use case there, let alone the need to have these guys on horseback. Again, much like their infantry counterparts, the Horse Grenadiers were far more often than not just acting like regular old heavy cavalry. And as time went on, while the name was preserved and the idea behind what the Grenadiers represented remained culturally, in terms of effective use on the battlefield, really they weren't that much different from any other unit. In the case of the British Horse Grenadier Guards, they were disbanded in the 1780s as part of a large series of army reforms that sought to further professionalize the British military to a higher standard. And because they were already practically the exact same kinds of cavalrymen as the other horse guards, the life guards and whatnot, well, that's where most of those men would wind up being reassigned, where really they would have some minor uniform changes that they have to get used to, but otherwise it's the same thing, right? They hadn't had to use their grenades in quite a while by that point, much as the infantry grenadiers hadn't been using grenades for quite a while at that point. Again, except for in sieges, and by the end of the 18th century, even when grenades were being employed in sieges, they weren't even necessarily being used by dedicated grenadier units. Really, it was more a matter of anyone who could get their hands on them would use them. Now, another good example, and actually probably the most famous example of them by far, of a regiment being called Horse Grenadiers, but effectively really just being another heavy cavalry unit, would be the French Mounted Grenadiers of the Imperial Guard during the Napoleonic era. Now, it was a highly renowned unit, a great deal of accomplishments under their belt, but they certainly weren't achieving those things by dismounting and throwing grenades, really in any context, siege or otherwise. That was just not a thing by the Napoleonic era. Their name, like so many others in the early modern era, didn't actually have a direct correlation with what their role was. Rather, it was more of a cultural designation. Basically, the idea of what a grenadier was, a large, powerful, courageous soldier at the front of any battle, the bravest and strongest in his regiment. That idea, that concept, is far more important than the original literal definition of a guy who throws grenades. You know, think about it in terms of the infantry. The grenadiers, they were originally the ones throwing the grenades, but by virtue of that, they were always the tallest soldiers, they were the strongest soldiers, and because they had to get in close, they were often the bravest, most courageous and whatnot soldiers as well. And so even after the idea of actually using grenades fell off, well, the reputation of a grenadier needs to be all of those things would remain, and it continued to be really quite important. Another major role of the cavalry, although a one that was very rarely, if ever, desired or even appreciated, was serving as a public order and anti-riot unit during times of strife. To this end, again in the case of the British Horse Grenadier Guards, when Parliament passed the Gin Act of 1736, which attempted to curb its consumption, according to the Medulla Historiae Anglicanae, very fun title, published in 1742, a detachment of the Life Guards and Horse Grenadier Guards paraded in Covent Garden, etc., in order to suppress any tumult that might happen on that account. Perhaps more notably, and certainly more notoriously, the Horse Grenadiers would also be deployed during the likes of the Spitalfield riots of 1765–69, and their last ever deployment was, again, against their own people during the infamous Gordon riots of 1780. But again, the primary advantage of having cavalry in anti-riot duties would be that they are mounted. These were large men on large horses who might be used to disperse crowds and sometimes literally ride over people. They're not going to be dismounting if they can help it, and they're certainly not about to use their grenades in central London. So, here again, whether in battle or on policing duty, the Horse Grenadiers are really just acting as another cavalry unit. Along yet more similar lines, the Horse Grenadier Guards would also, alongside their horse and foot compatriots, partake in a wide variety of military escorts and parades and guard duties, from coronations to funerals, and perhaps most grim of all, in high-profile executions, such as those of the Earl of Kilmarnock and Lord Balmerino, who had both taken part in the Jacobite Rebellion and were, upon their capture, subsequently executed at the Tower of London, which was that day, according to the London Magazine, guarded by some 1,000 of the Foot Guards, a troop of Life Guards, and one of Horse Grenadier Guards. High security executions indeed, but again, if for some reason something happens to disrupt your parade procession, some guy rushes at the king or something, well, you're not going to be hurling a hand grenade in that situation. Your sword and just the fact that you have a horse are going to be far more practical for you in those circumstances. But here's the thing. Just because the Horse Grenadiers, whether in Britain or anywhere else, were often filling the same role as the rest of the cavalry, doesn't necessarily mean they were given the same privileges or treated in the same way. Especially when you had a situation, like we said before in the British case, where one unit is being recruited from regular soldiers and maybe the other portion of the cavalry that they are meant to be a part of, if they're all hiring from the gentility. In which case, the Horse Grenadier Guards would often balk at not being given the same level of respect as their Horse Guards counterparts, despite fulfilling many of the same roles. Their positions in the parades might not be quite so nice. They may get more boring assignments, and that all had social implications that may not be immediately obvious, but which would be very important. Tensions and drama between different military organizations can get pretty intense, and that's especially the case in the British regimental system, and doubly so during the early modern era. Just as one little example of how these tensions could impact an individual soldier's career, for example, we can look to the rather scornful memoir of John Railton, where he writes of his own experiences of such prejudice, owing in the first instance to his experience in the infantry, and in the second to his time with those ungentlemanly Horse Grenadiers. When I was discharged out of the Guards, there being no vacancies in the second troop of Horse Grenadier Guards wherein I had first served, therefore I offered my service in the first troop, and was approved of, and my character undeniable from the second troop, but upon hearing how I had been served in the Foot Guards, they would not be concerned with me upon any conditions. I then went immediately to His Majesty's Secretary at War, and told him what passed betwixt the officers and me, but he made answer that if the officers of the Horse Grenadiers gave me a good character, he would give me a very bad one. And so to conclude our video, who were the Horse Grenadiers? Well, obviously their precise nature would vary by time and place, but to speak in very broad terms, they were a unit of cavalry who were originally trained to act as mounted infantry, riding into battle on their horses before dismounting and fighting as traditional grenadiers. However, despite their intended role and its relative popularity in the 17th century, as the early modern era progressed, warfare became larger, more mobile, and again, for many different reasons, but the precise need for that kind of unit became less and less. Even the plain old infantry grenadiers would, throughout the 18th century, largely abandon their use of grenades in favor of acting like heavy shock infantry. Their name, their reputation in that way, became far more important than any literal distinction or training, for that matter, on the battlefield. And so too was this the case for the Horse Grenadiers, who found the actual opportunities to practice their grenade throwing very few and far between, instead being employed most often as traditional heavy cavalry, charging into and shattering enemy formations right alongside the rest of their mounted brethren in the Life Guards. Cavalry being more rare than infantry, of course, that was simply where they were more valuable more often. The designation of grenadiers, then, became more about the size and the strength, the traditions and the courage of these men, their assumed elite status, as it were, more so than their actual jobs. Again, same thing as the Foot Grenadiers. The name was more cultural than technical, and while the specific title of Horse Grenadiers would continue to occasionally pop up throughout history, for example, the modern-day Argentinian Regiment of Mounted Grenadiers, it would only ever be just that. It's an honorific title. So as ever, thank you all for watching, and until the next time, my dear viewer, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants. Special thanks are, of course, owed to the Native Oaks supporters on Patreon who make videos like this one possible. And remember that if you'd like to learn more about this topic, or any of the military history of the long 18th century more broadly, you'll find a free digital library of primary sources, including, of course, the ones that I used to make this video, over at nativeoak.org. I also have a few other videos about the history of grenadiers on this channel that might interest you, and I'll be sure to link them down below as well. But before you go and watch those, remember that another great way to support the educational work of this channel is through your engagement. So if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to give it a thumbs up and let me know your thoughts in a comment. Especially if you have any recommendations for future content, I'm always taking suggestions. Although, of course, no promises on my turnaround, because even if I really love a topic, the list is quite long. In any case, thank you all for watching.